In order to better see the apotheotheistic dialectic in action and played out in real time in our own lives, we need to understand the dualistic nature of the game we are all forced to play. Both sides of the chessboard aim to sway people to their side, strategically manipulating the people in the way they interact with the core pillars of civilization. However, if the adversary is attempting to implement a mass deception for all of humanity, he must have a hand on both sides of the game board. Hello and welcome to part 3 in the Final Act series. This video is entitled The True Dark and the False Light, the Chess Pieces of the Adversary. In the last video, I showed the Gnostic or the apotheotheistic dialectic in action, how two diametrically opposing belief systems attempt to arrive at the same truth by means of an individualistic religion known as Gnosticism, and how that religion originated in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 when man fell into sin. Man, by means of seeking to pursue their own desires, aim to become their own gods to themselves by worshipping the self and interpreting what they think is good and evil from their own personal perspective. It will be necessary for you to be familiar with the material in my previous two videos in order for you to understand what I will be covering in this video. Today, I will be again flying my flight simulator while I dive into what I like to call the dark and light factions of the apotheotheistic dialectic, specifically unwrapping how each faction operates with respect to how it weaves its ideologies into culture. I'll also be whipping out the history books and showing how both aspects trickled down from the Garden of Eden story and created their own separate distinct principles, contrasting the religions of the dark and light factions, and how they have a systematic influence on the core pillars of civilization. As we went over in the last video, we are living in a manipulated simulation that is controlled by the game masters of society, those who have manipulating hands in the pillars such as politicians, celebrities, and other elite members of society that pull the strings of both sides of the dialectic in order to influence those that look up to them to bring about the desired outcome. Of course, these GMs chase after their own desires as well, and as we will unpack, are more so being influenced themselves by an ancient and greater ideological apotheotheistic religion. But real quick, I'd like to clear some things up before we dive further into this very complex topic, and give a bit of a disclaimer which will carry forward for much of this series as we get further along into it. In this video, I'm going to be giving an introduction into the different attributes of the adversary, as well as talking about the people who uphold his very dark and evil ideologies as a way of life. And we will also be covering more of the specific deceptions he attempts to pass off as being truth, some of which are very subtle and easy to misconstrue as being an ostensibly Christian worldview, if not critically understood. The information in this series is recommended for mature audiences only, not just in age, but in spiritual growth, so please use discretion if children are in the room while viewing, or if you struggle with topics such as Satanism, the occult, abuse and ritual abuse, or drug use. I won't be graphic in my descriptions of these topics, but I also won't hold back when explaining the realities of what takes place in the lives of those who venerate Satan. We can't pretend it's not happening, and it doesn't do any good to water it down. There is a method to the enemy's madness beyond wanton malice that we will be getting into, and an awareness of the true dark reality of those things will be necessary to understand how the whole system perpetuates itself. Also, I do not intend to sugarcoat the deceptive aspects and some of the nitty-gritty of what these certain false religions and vain philosophies actually believe, so coming into this with a sober mind and a heart and ear towards the Lord is extremely important. 2 Corinthians 10:4-5 says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." When our minds and hearts are centered on Jesus' life, and not through our own knowledge and understanding, we bring every thought and theory that the world might present to us first and foremost to Him. Even the most blatant of the enemy's lies become a way for the Lord to reveal the truth of His Son to us, because through it we easily see exactly how the adversary is working to mislead us away from Jesus. You already have some experience with this, and it's why I went into a protracted mental rant going into the stupefying heretical tenets of early AD Gnosticism in the last video. And it's because I want you to be able to recognize the enemy's favorite lie when it shows up in more seemingly innocuous but deceptive iterations that aren't overtly screeching about how the devil is actually God and God is actually the devil. All of this to say, approach this with an open mind and be willing to listen to the voice of the Lord. It's very possible that your foundational beliefs will be shaken to their core, because the unfortunate reality is that we have all believed lies from the enemy. As we established last time, we were born inherently deceived. Always remember to trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not onto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Our own perceptions and misconceptions of God can sometimes be the biggest hindrances to understanding His words, which is why it's important to remember that God is greater than our own imperfect understanding of His attributes and nature. So if something here in these videos causes you to question your deeply held beliefs about God, good. Remember, your faith is not in those beliefs being absolutely true and free of flaw. It's in the true and flawless Son of God who exists apart from our own perceptions of Him. Lastly, before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's topic, I previously flushed out the good versus evil paradigm that gets created out of our desires based on our position in the Matrix. However, I want to avoid using that language moving forward, because I don't want to put a staple on any particular narrative that would label itself as good or another as bad/evil. Because as we learned in the last video, these labels are very subjective when applied by human beings. In reality, God is the arbiter and standard who determines the real good and evil. Good is just a word to describe what we know to be true about God's attributes and what He creates. And evil is thus anything that departs or perverts those attributes and creations away from His nature. Our version of good and evil is tainted by our inherent belief of the great lie and the adversary's reframing of the law to his own rebellious ends. So it isn't exactly accurate to refer to the dualistic sides of the apotheotheistic dialectic with those terms, because eating from both the evil and good sides of the tree are sin and doing evil in God's eyes. I've already begun to use this language, but dark and light is the more precise speech that should be used, because it has more so to do with how those terms appeal to aspects of Satanism and false Judeo-Christian adjacent religions respectively, which play a huge role in apotheotheism. I will be diving into those subjects rather in depth in this video, but all that to say, just for clarity's sake, I will be using this more specific language going forward and referring to the dualistic sides of the tree/dialectic as light and dark rather than good and evil from now on. Let's get into it. I established in the previous video that the origin of apotheotheism goes back to Genesis 3, and that the philosophical and Gnostic religious movements of modern apotheotheistic thought seem to appear in the first century church groups, combining with modern philosophy and remnant paganism. One other thing I haven't mentioned, but maybe you've picked up on already, is that apotheotheism is outright worship of the adversary. If you are worshiping self and attempting to take the place of God, that is venerating the adversary's rebellion and the adversary himself by proxy. After the birth of apotheotheism in Genesis 3, it quickly took root in the form of graven image worship and paganism. After Cain was cast out after the murder of his brother Abel, his family line turned away from God and towards the worship of false gods. After the Tower of Babel account and the confusion of languages, Cain's line split off from each other, grouping with those who spoke the same language. However, they continued to worship the same false gods. It's just because their languages were confused, they didn't call their false gods by the same name anymore. This is why there are so many different false gods. It's because they're worshiping the same god, but one group called them by one name and another by a different name. For thousands and thousands of generations, the line of Cain chased after false idols and false gods that involved blood, sex, and sacrificial rituals of unspeakable evil. But yet, there was belief in these idols because evil spiritual entities would attach themselves to these idols so that worship could be directed towards them, and through their manipulation in the spiritual realm, they granted the fleshly desires of those who elevated them. This is why God told the people of Israel not to marry into the line of Canaan, because it was so easy to forget the true God for a God that granted base pleasures and desires of the one who worshipped it. It's why God told Abraham to get out of the land of Ur, because that land was full of idol worshippers, and God was going to establish a people in a land where they couldn't be led astray by lustful pleasures and the beautiful women of those cultures who worshiped false gods, much as we saw happen with Solomon, Ahab, and many others in the Old Testament. Through the generational line of Adam and Eve's son, Cain, cultures developed and races became more distinct. The types of gods they worshipped also became more distinct. Individual religions were established, and temples and special locations were designated as specific places of worship for these idols and false gods. In the Bible, these were described as high places, which in most cases was simply an altar and some sacred object which represented the false god like a statue or symbol that was built on an elevated piece of ground. From these high places, even the people of Israel worshipped Baal and Molech, turning away from their Savior. See Jeremiah 32. Ultimately, humans were at the center of the idol worship. The worship of these gods was never about uplifting and praising the deity for genuine worship, but rather to hope to meet the needs of the community for the sake of survival and quality of life. The god that was worshipped was associated with a particular need or desire that propelled their society forward. If you wanted a good crop and economical success with your livestock, you prayed to the sun god to shine good light on your fields. You also likely prayed to some sort of weather god that he would bless the land with rain, but also appease him to withhold severe storms that could damage crops and cattle. If you wanted your wife to be healthy during pregnancy and desired a large family of sons that carried on your family name, you prayed to a god, or usually a goddess, of fertility. If you wanted a successful and happy life, you venerated gods of wealth, prosperity, and abundance. If you wanted to conquer the surrounding countries and rule over the land with an iron fist, you prayed to gods of war or destruction that had dark, malevolent personalities. Either way, it was fueled out of desire. From here was where the split between the light and dark sides of the dualistic dialectic formed. False gods of both light and dark positions were venerated by people to shuttle their ideal version of life based on where they stood in their matrix. These gods were even labeled as good and evil gods. Those who worshipped evil gods were feared by those who worshipped good gods because the common practice of child human sacrifice was a lot scarier than the more humane sacrifices of plants and animals to the good gods. For example, think of the Disney film Mulan and the conflict between the threat of the Huns and the small village that Mulan lived in. The townsfolk and the Fa family lived peacefully in their village until the Huns crossed the Great Wall and invaded the land. It's not as explicit in the film, but both the Huns and the townspeople would have worshipped false gods in respect to the Chinese culture, as we see with the repeated themes of honoring and praying to the ancestor spirits of their culture. However, Huns were formidable foes and feared by everyone due to their bloody warlike practices, and the historical Huns absolutely followed those same ancestor worship traditions, but venerating their conquering leaders instead of the peaceful ones. Yet within this world of many deities, whether you worshipped a good god or an evil god, you were still worshipping a false god. Both were idol and self-desire worship set up by the Adversary to get humans to continue in the participation of his rebellion against the Almighty. Graven image worship still turns the focus inward on how the self can be in control to have the most productive life and be the controllers of their own lives. You can be like God. Later on, around the time Christianity began to take shape after the time of the Apostles, actual direct worship of physical graven images began to be replaced with the indirect worship of archetypal graven images to elevate oneself through the veneration and pursuit of various schools of philosophical thought. Naturally, these schools of thought melded into light and dark factions respective to the beliefs of the people and what they desired, much as the polytheistic religions had done with specific personified gods. Pagan idol worship still continued, especially in Eastern cultures, but this kind of intellectually centered self-worship or self-empowerment was always present within graven image worship. The worship of things like wealth, personal strength, elevated life status, and yes, wisdom and knowledge makes the self the center of veneration, and had always been found within most pagan religions and spiritual practices throughout the world in both light and dark systems. Because again, the end goal of the individual was to ultimately receive their desires. The graven image was just a way to channel the worship towards that idolized desire. It wasn't just limited to organized formal leading religions and priesthoods, but even the most remote tribes that venerate the spirits of various aspects of nature in hopes of receiving the might of a bull or the cunning of a serpent in a battle against a rival village exhibit this behavior. Totem poles are the perfect illustration of this, with each animal acting as the representation of an idealized trait to be emulated in one's own actions or environment, and as an aspiration to rise up to it without any personified god in particular being attached to it. The Greek peasants praying to Demeter for a bountiful harvest, and the locally sourced vegan bakery that makes sure to let everyone know to thank the earth for the food, are essentially both venerating agriculture as their ideal of choice. We can grow our own food. Look how great this is. Let's make it the center of my life and how I expend my energy. See how idolatry ultimately aims to elevate a personal desire no matter who it is or what they are worshipping? They are worshipping the creature rather than the creator. If one god didn't show themselves to be as powerful as another, then worship would be redirected to that more powerful god. Daniel chapter 3 tells the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they stood up against Nebuchadnezzar and his demand to bow to his statue. After the trio were pulled out of the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than to serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Daniel 3:28-29. After seeing that God had saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar declared that he was more powerful than any other gods, because none had ever seen another god who had been able to rescue someone in that fashion before. A god who seemed to have the ability to grant more power to a person or community would be the one who would be worshipped over the previous god who couldn't seem to give that power. It was all geared towards the individual and which god could enhance the self more than the other. Again, the worship of all pagan powers has an aspect of self-empowerment at its core. But as rational thought and belief in reason and science developed over the centuries, the focus of these various domains that might have previously had a specific god or gods associated with it slowly became more humanistic and centered around the progress of humans themselves being the focal points of these areas of change. Remember, the pursuit of sinful desires is what caused Adam and Eve to fall. The pursuit of idols, whether of good or ill will intent, lead to death. And this is because Satan uses both good and evil to get people to direct worship towards himself. In order to do this, the adversary must place himself at the center of the dialectic. You see, he has two sides to him. This is why I said a second ago that it's not accurate to say Satan has a good side and an evil side, but more so has a dark and light aspect to his character. His dark side is what was portrayed through his rebellion against the Almighty, and inversely, his pursuit to counterfeit everything God is or does is his light side character, and comes from the fact that Satan used to be an exalted servant of the Most High. Remember, Satan and Lucifer are just titles. Lucifer means Lightbringer, Satan means Adversary. So because Satan exists on both sides of the spectrum, he knows how to use the desires of man's hearts to turn people away from God. He caters to a person's individual matrix, whether those desires are good or evil. The worship of dark and light idols didn't just happen back during ancient times. People today choose to set up their matrix in either a light or dark aspect for the pursuit of their own enlightenment. But again, regardless of where they set up their matrix camp, it contributes to the broad network matrix of society because the flip-flopping between dark and light is how we function as a society. Here's how it's structured. Dark side factions focus on embodying Satan's rebellious actions, being like God by holding an attitude of doing whatever the heck you want. These people aim to chase after the pleasures and the works of the flesh. Light side factions aim to be like God by worshiping anything that relates to him, whether that's one of his attributes such as the fruits of the Spirit or an aspect of creation. The adversary is really good at making light side entities look like God on the surface by emphasizing his good attributes. But God is not defined by his attributes. His attributes are how we experience his character through a relationship with him. Think of it this way. Consider the phrase, God is loving. Yes, that statement is 100% true, but really it's a bad way to state it because we can fall into the trap of measuring God up to our standards of love. The precise way of saying the previous phrase would be, God is love. He is the embodiment of love. But we can fall into the trap of worshiping the attribute of love, or the attribute of joy and happiness, or the attribute of peace. Light order factions focus on the idolization of the fruits of the Spirit, and dark factions focus on the indulgences of the works of the flesh. See Galatians 6, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 13, 1-2, and 2 Corinthians 11, 14. Through the development of distinct dark and light-centered philosophical schools of thought, formal groups known as mystery schools began to form. These mystery schools were basically gatherings of people of like mind that met on a regular basis to discuss topics like philosophy, religion, politics, and social economics based on where their ideals fell on the dark and light spectrum. It was a way for esoteric knowledge to be shared to others and focused on the gaining of knowledge through the expanse of free thinking and the study of literature. Individuals within the school who had access to large quantities of this select information were considered more enlightened than the others who did not. And because this information was accessible by limited amounts of people, it was considered esoteric. So naturally, the more enlightened individuals were somewhat placed on a hierarchy over those who were less enlightened, and those lesser illuminated would gravitate toward those who spent the hours and hours studying that knowledge so that they could learn from them. These enlightened individuals would then bestow this knowledge to the common person, enlightening them to the secrets that they held. So people would specifically join these club-type gatherings for the purpose of being mentored by the more knowledgeable, and in the process becoming one of the enlightened themselves. Granted, the concept of a mystery school isn't something that just flowered up after pagan idol worship faded away in the 1st and 2nd centuries. That is an aspect of it, but really it's more of another stage of a religion's life cycle, if you will, than anything of its own. Think of a mystery school more so as what's left over of a dead religion once the common folk ceased to formally and publicly practice the tenets of that particular religious faith. Followers of that religion might have fallen out of worshipping the gods of that pantheon or upholding specific rites or practices of that culture's dominant religious pillar of civilization within that sphere of the societal simulation. But the overall belief system of the dead religion doesn't go away, nor do the experts in their fields keeping it alive. Remember, religion is a core pillar of civilization that the GMs of society control. The priesthood class individuals that led their faiths were the ones who were the most devoted to the ideas making up the core doctrines they espoused and taught. When the average Joe stops following, say, Zoroastrianism sometime in the early BCs, the various religious leaders that used to lead groups of followers now become the founders of mystery schools, meant instead for the purpose of bringing in new people to work their way up the Enlightenment ladder so that their philosophies live on, as well as continue to try and advance their agendas in the general sphere of society. It's basically the old religion, but on a smaller scale. So some religions were structured with the priests who had all the wisdom and the words of the gods to bring to the people. Once the greater people stopped listening, the leaders of the religions were turned into the leaders of the mystery schools, and the dead religions of the people turned into the mystery schools of the select few. Even though there were many branch-offs from these old religions to the small-scale cults, the worship of the Adversary was and is at the crux of these mystery school orders. But depending on whether the school is of light or dark order determines which facet of the Adversary becomes venerated. The basic structure that I mentioned before is the same. I plan on designating a whole video each for talking about how modern light and dark order schools function, but here I'm going to give a quick rundown of what each faction believes and the history of it with a few examples. Dark order mystery schools are nearly focused all on one thing: the involvement and the indulgence of the self, up to the point of becoming self-contradictory in one's actual belief system. The modern iterations of these schools are centered around the idea that the prevailing religious order, specifically the widespread and influential nature of Christianity, is an oppressive system that should be resisted because it hinders the freedom of the individual to please a God that they see as being unworthy of their obedience. To that end, the left-hand path is less focused on creating a paradigm for understanding the truth of the world, and is instead more focused on tearing down the existing paradigm that stifles their ability to determine the truth for themselves. In other words, Dark Order belief systems are less about believing in something and more about believing in yourself, as an idealized sense that you know what's best for your own life and nobody else has the right to tell you otherwise. Oftentimes, this is thinly justified reasoning to simply do what they want or what they believe to be right based on their own perspective. Dark path esotericism is fairly solipsistic by nature, and that also means organized dark path mystery schools are chaotic as a general rule. They mostly believe that breaking cultural and religious norms is the primary path to deconstructing the system around them, which they hold to be the source of their problems. Very little uniformity of actual definitive doctrine exists within their official core tenets, and they range from pure atheist materialists to full-on magicians fully immersed into the occult, practicing rituals involving blood and sexual acts. But all of their actual practices usually boil down to some form of self-affirmation, and whatever happens to be the most effective way to actively disrespect, mock, or undermine the acceptable societal standard. In the modern day, these schools of esoteric belief often worship or otherwise venerate Satan directly, not just because it shocks the predominantly Christian majority, but also because they admire him as being an independent creature that can do whatever the heck he wants, and hence people take on the same rebellious attitude and find satisfaction in manipulating the things and the people they interact with as they please. Molech, Baphomet, and Lilith are also figures commonly depicted especially in New Age, Wiccan, or Neo-Pagan circles for the same reasons. But Satan, or an analog of him in a traditionally evil god like Set or Ahriman, tends to be the primary focus of actual worship as an emphasis on the open embrace of evil. Some worship Satan in a metaphoric sense as part of their open self-actualization worship towards themselves, and some will literally worship him because they want to be like him. Dark Order schools are where you will commonly find actual graven image worship still practiced today in the developed world. People that follow Dark Order beliefs are often generally referred to by others as Satanists, and specifically this term is being more commonly used as time progresses as a self-descriptor by left-hand path adherents. A man by the name of Aleister Crowley is probably one of the most well-known practicers of the occult. Born in 1875 in Warwickshire, England, he grew up in a wealthy family and was raised in a Protestant sect of Christianity. He rejected Christianity at a rather young age, joining the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn at age 23, a Dark Order mystery school that studied the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, a confabulation of Hermes, the Greek god of medicine, and the Egyptian god of knowledge, Thoth, that originated in Ptolemaic Egypt and was known as the creator of alchemy. From there, he devoted his life to, quote, being on the side of Satan, unquote, practicing unspeakable acts of bestiality, necrophilia, and having sex with his mistresses as often as possible. He used LSD, opium, cocaine, and chloroform for recreational use, indulging in self-pleasure to, quote-unquote, achieve enlightenment, and truly become like the evil one. Crowley is a good example of what happens when one gives himself over to the true evil attributes of the enemy. The dark side of occultism focuses on the rejection of social norms, laws, and the breaking of traditions. They embrace chaos in an effort to, quote-unquote, find spiritual freedom. They are very vocal about their belief in self-deification, self-serving, and bowing to no one. Crowley was the one who coined the popular phrase, "do what thou wilt," in his writing known as the Book of the Law, which he claimed he transcribed directly from a demonic spiritual entity. The premise of it encourages readers that the law is fulfilled when you do what you desire, and through the path of do what thou wilt, true authentic life is found. In the modern day, the do what thou wilt mantra is still upheld as the primary focus of all Dark Order mystery schools. They want to stand out from everyone by being the red-headed stepchild to the rest of society. They find satisfaction by being seen as different, creepy, and weird. Arguably, the most prominent and public Dark Order organization today is the Church of Satan. Originally founded by Anton LaVey in 1966, the religion took off due to popular interest in witchcraft and occultism in that time, a lot of it being offshoots of Crowley's teachings and his own Hermetic order. The Church of Satan came more into the public circle in the 1980s, facing heavy scrutiny from the satanic panic ritual abuse allegations. The public narrative was thought that members of the religion were practicing blood-drinking rituals and sacrificing children in the name of Satan. But according to an investigative report released by the FBI in 2020, LaVey insisted that, quote, most people who associated with the Church of Satan during that time were fanatics, cultists, and weirdos, unquote. Their belief states that they don't worship or even believe in the spiritual entity of Satan. They focus more on the concept of an archetypal Satan, which is used as a source of power that humans can tap into and express their true identity. Members of the Church of Satan will say they are atheists, and those who believe in any supernatural entity are quote-unquote insane. Quoting Peter Gilmore, the current high priest of the Church of Satan, quote, Satanism begins with atheism. We begin with the universe and say, it's indifferent, there's no God, there's no devil, no one cares, unquote. In another quote, he continues, quote, we do not believe in the supernatural. To the Satanists, he is his own God. Satan is a symbol of man living as his prideful carnal nature dictates. Some Satanists extend this symbol to encompass the evolutionary force of entropy that permeates all of nature and provides the drive for survival and propagation inherent in all living things, unquote. The Church of Satan believes Satan is the pleroma of existence and our fight for survival, which, if you remember from the last video, means fullness or the end-all be-all of what humans should strive for. The individual can become their own God by being the determiner of their own destiny. In 1975, an officer of the U.S. Army by the name of Michael Aquino established a new satanic religion known as the Temple of Set. Aquino was a member of the Church of Satan prior to this, but was unhappy with where it was heading and decided to split off and establish his own satanic religion. According to Aquino, unlike the members of his old congregation, he actually did invoke Satan himself, who allegedly revealed that his true name was Set, an ancient Egyptian god of chaos who rules over deserts and storms. They believe Set is the god who gave humans knowledge and intellect, but they don't worship him as a deity. Rather, they focus on an individualized religion of self-deification to bring immortality to their consciousness. Instead of a purely archetypal Satan figure that is venerated as a symbol, like in the Church of Satan, they uphold Set as an actual god who guides and teaches, and many members see him as their own patron in their spiritual journey to deification. There is a big emphasis on the individual within Setian beliefs, and all rituals are invoked to elevate self. It's much more esoteric in nature, with 6 degrees that members can proceed along, each carrying more responsibility than the last, and allowing members to read a continuum of sacred texts that are not available to non-members, and draws much more from ancient mystery school practices than their parent organization. On the lighter side, or you might say the more laid-back side of the Dark Order spectrum, the Satanic Temple is another newly developed religious movement. Only just founded in 2013, their goal is to, quote, fight a perceived intrusion of Christian values on American politics, unquote. From their perspective, Satan isn't a spiritual being or even a representation of evil or desire. They uphold the literary depiction of Satan as the red devil with horns and a pointy tail as one who was the quote-unquote eternal rebel in his actions against God. Therefore, members seek to rebel against social norms and arbitrary authority, or see Satan's rebellious actions as a metaphor for the promotion of skepticism to establish beliefs and norms, as well as curiosity of supposedly forbidden knowledge. They promote benevolence and empathy from all humans and use this over-the-top satanic imagery to promote typically left-leaning secularist views on civil rights, social justice, egalitarianism, and the separation of church and state. They use religious parody and satire to gain attention and to lobby for the re-evaluation of the perceptions of the government, and are focused on highlighting their beliefs on religious hypocrisy and the encroachment of religious freedom. They mostly harp on Christianity as their primary example of this overreach, and say their religion is just as legitimate as Christians, even lobbying to erect a statue of Baphomet next to a monument of the Ten Commandments that sat in front of the Capitol buildings in Arkansas and Oklahoma. Compared to LaVeyan Satanism, or Setianism, members of the Satanic Temple don't really invoke satanic rituals or engage in this sort of behavior beyond their performance art, outside of maybe burning incense to make their house smell nice and honor those who have lived before them. The black magic that many practice in esoteric satanic religions is very rare, if not even used at all, as the satanic imagery is all meant to be their way of protesting what they see as an intrusion of Christian values into their lives. Members of the Church of Satan, for the most part, don't even recognize satanic temple members as Satanists, but yet, just as most all other dark religions do, through the ratification of the rebellious nature of Satan, they still promote the ideology of wanting to do things their own way and elevate the self. In all these Satanism variants, whether openly pagan or simply using associated imagery to promote a spicier variety of atheism, you can still see the common thread. They want to be God. Whether it's rebelling against societal norms imposed by the cultural authority, or just becoming completely evil to spite God and his laws openly. They want to sit in the place of the Almighty, determining the nature of good and evil for themselves, just as Satan did. Hence, their admiration of him as either a literal or figurative figure of worship. And an attempt to be like God and to sit in his place is the very act of living by the tree of knowledge paradigm that the adversary loves so much. But, as I've alluded to, the Light Order lives by the tree of knowledge paradigm just as much as the dark side does. I mentioned a bit ago that Lucifer means Lightbringer. In the eyes of a Light Order mystery school, Lucifer was actually the good guy. Light Order schools promote freedom to the people by establishing a society that encourages people to live according to their own free will. The do what thou wilt archetype more or less still exists, but the focal point is finding freedom by doing good things and being a good citizen of the world that we all share. They say Lucifer was the one to bring knowledge to this world and God was withholding it from them, God really being this demiurge concept. Check out this recommended reading list found on mysteryschoolinT.com. There are multiple listings of works showing people who outright proclaim they worship Lucifer. They literally say that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was the protagonist and God was the antagonist. But more commonly, most light side followers will say they don't worship Lucifer, but simply follow the quote-unquote light of God, or some platonic ideal of truth, and through that knowledge and the pursuit of the lifelong journey of enlightenment is how God reveals itself, again really being the universal source that the Gnostics worship. The early church ran into a number of issues with people being pulled away into these schools of thought that seemed on the surface to be close to Christianity, but in reality, the Gnostic theology couldn't stand up to the real truth of Jesus. As is so common, the self instead became the focal point and was uplifted in a sense of self-empowerment that a person could control his or her own destiny and determine the outcome of their salvation. Aspects of Christianity were intertwined with their own version of what they felt was the true gospel. They thought they were worshiping God, but in reality had created a religion of self-worship by formulating an ideal version of who they thought God should be. Or in other words, a dead idol in the shape of the living God, but conformed to the image of man's own salvation by knowledge and an achievement of a Christ-like consciousness. Essentially, it means they believe that someone can become so much like God that they can save themselves from their own sins by fulfilling God's commands and abiding by the law. Or in other words, a self-actualization, works-based salvation. I also made the connection in a previous video that the law is the embodiment of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Therefore, when these sects of Christianity weave their version of salvation into the fulfillment of the law, they were using the knowledge of good and evil as their means to appease God. Often, the Christian God of the Bible is completely thrown out, and other aspects of the natural or intellectual world were thought to be the means by which this higher knowledge was revealed. Hence, all the talk about the universe revealing truths to them, and other such New Age speak. The early Gnostic splinter cults are in fact where a lot of the modern-day theosophical New Age beliefs originally became prominent. Theosophy, a combination of theology and philosophy, is another mystery-based school of thought that is essentially Hinduism combined with Gnostic language and beliefs, that through meditation and guidance by Platonic ideals of wisdom, knowledge, and philosophy, one can reach enlightenment. We'll be covering theosophy and its influence more deeply later on, but for now, just know that variations of theosophy and other offshoot religions that all integrated the salvation by knowledge Gnostic beliefs into their own doctrine are often recognized under the umbrella term Luciferian, because it was supposedly Lucifer who sought out the knowledge of good to find freedom from evil and to bring light into the evil aspects of the world that the demiurge created. It might have a more outwardly moral air to it, but you can see how it acts merely as the other side of the coin to the Dark Order's Satanist beliefs, and is still utterly incompatible with the gospel message of the true light of the world. But even still, these self-actualization works-based beliefs that came out of Gnosticism melded into many of the light order Christian cults that exist today. Here are a few examples. Joseph Smith received secret knowledge through a vision supposedly from Jesus Christ himself, who allegedly claimed that all the current church doctrines had become twisted and the true Christian church needed to be reestablished. Through several subsequent visions by Christ and other supposed angels, Smith received an additional testament of Christ known today as the Book of Mormon on golden plates in an Egyptian language that was eventually translated into English with the help of some seer stones. These golden plates were never proven to even exist, as the angel who presented the plates to Smith took them back. However, a handful of people claimed to see the plates, 8 of which were of Smith's immediate family. But the entire Mormon religion upholds its foundational doctrine on these quote-unquote truths that are barely 200 years old, and claim they are the true Christians because they received knowledge that wasn't revealed to other Protestants. Only they have access to who God truly is, and only they will reach the top-tier level of heaven after death. See? Just another attempt for mankind to reach the top-tier level of existence to become closer to God. The Jehovah's Witnesses were formed when a man by the name of Charles Taze Russell began to refute foundational doctrines of Christianity, including the immortality of the soul, the second coming of Jesus, the Trinity, and the final judgment of the world. Russell grew up in a suburb of Pittsburgh in the late 1800s. He grew up Presbyterian, but towards his mid-20s he began to question the doctrines of the Reformed Protestant teachings. He felt that it didn't make sense for a loving God to send those who disobeyed him into an eternal punishment of hell. Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in an eternal hell or punishment, but rather those who are wicked will just cease to exist after death in a doctrine known as annihilation. He also rejected the doctrine of the Trinity because he believed the concept lacked biblical support and argued that it had been introduced to Christianity from pagan influences. He promoted these beliefs by means of publishing a magazine known as Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, which is still around to this day. It's known today as just the Watchtower and is central to the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Their magazine isn't like the Book of Mormon in that it's a second testament of Christ, but they uphold the teachings in the magazine as just as infallible as the Bible, and believers are strongly encouraged to read the magazine because it provides doctrinal instruction and guidance based on their interpretation of the Bible. Jehovah's Witnesses uphold a salvation by knowledge theology. Their interpretations of Scripture is based on the beliefs of one guy who didn't care for the teachings of the Trinity and hell because he didn't like them. He believed his interpretations of Scripture were truth, and that the traditional doctrines of Protestant Christianity were of pagan influence, which, by the way, the Protestant Reformation had been 400 years prior to the founding of Charles Taze Russell's religion. Literal centuries in the making, upheld by thousands of faithful believers. But yet, Russell felt it was all a farce. Charles Russell became God. He set himself apart, creating his own personalized matrix of Christianity, and through preaching, his writings in the magazine, and the distribution of Jehovah's Witness Bible tracts, managed to convince others that his version of truth was the real truth, and that salvation is not obtained by faith alone. A works-based religion is apotheotheism. Another Christian Gnostic religion is the Christian Science movement, and was founded by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy in 1879. She wrote a book entitled Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. The book uses the Bible to integrate New Age philosophy into basic properties of Christianity, such as creation, prayer, the sacraments, and the atonement, but also the book flushes out methods in which how the New Age ties into medicine, psychology, and holistic healing. Christian Science adds in a science and healing element to the primitive state of Christianity. However, there are some pretty major discrepancies between the theology of Christian Science and the theology of traditional Christianity. Specifically, Christian Science believes that reality is purely spiritual and the material world is an illusion, and that everything physical has a spiritual connection to it. For example, they believe that disease and sickness is a mental fluke rather than a physical disorder, and that sickness should be treated by prayer rather than medicine. Sickness is a result of misaligned beliefs, which are responsible for the illusion of ill health. The Christian Science Church doesn't mandate members avoid medical care, they just iterate that healing is most effective when prayer is the sole proprietor of the healing. But this often leads to Christian Science members avoiding medical care for fear of being ostracized by other church members. This has been taken to such an extreme level, so much so that the avoidance of medical treatment was blamed for the deaths of many members and their children. A handful of these people were prosecuted and convicted of manslaughter and neglect by the state. But even so, the Christian Science Church has doctrine to allegedly spiritually cure ailments such as asthma, broken bones, cataracts, addictions to substances, arthritis, and even cancer. Furthermore, they believe heaven and hell do not exist, rather they are spiritual states of mind. Mary Baker Eddy rejected several biblical teachings, including believing in a non-Trinitarian theology, meaning the divineness of the Trinity was considered polytheistic. Jesus was seen just as an ordinary man, but his life was considered an excellent example of a Christ concept and illustrated what it meant to be like God. The crucifixion was not a divine sacrifice for sins, but rather an ultimate ascension, if you will, of being in oneness with God. Church members are encouraged to be like Jesus because by following his example, one can be at one with God. See how Christian Science also believes in an ascension to godhood? Not to mention how a singular individual again created their own version of Christianity to fit their concept of Christ. Many were drawn to Christian Science because of their non-belief in hell. Peace and healing are promised, and because anyone can become at one with God, the forgiveness of sins is unnecessary. These Christian cults and other light order mystery schools are just another variation of Gnosticism, and we know that's not how God operates. Many of these Christian cults may sound like the real deal on the surface, but when held up to the truth of the gospel, their doctrine falls apart. Remember, the tree of life was distinct from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. His gospel has been fully revealed to us. Romans 16:25 and 26 says, "Now to him who is able to establish you in accordance with my gospel, the message I proclaim about Jesus Christ, in keeping with the revelation of the mystery hidden for long ages past, but now revealed and made known through the prophetic writings by the command of the eternal God, so that all the Gentiles might come to the obedience that comes from faith." There is nothing secret about the gospel. That's the whole point of it. Salvation isn't obtained by seeking esoteric knowledge, but contrary to the truth, that's what these mystery schools taught. Paul speaks about this in 2 Corinthians 11:3-4, saying, "But I fear, lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For he who comes preaching another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it." My whole point of listing and explaining all these pagan and Christian examples is to show even from an exoteric level how blatantly apotheotheistic both light and dark religious factions are, and how disconnected they are from God's truth. They preach their own versions of Jesus, the gospel, and the revelation of the Holy Spirit. I literally pulled the majority of my facts on these belief systems off the Wikipedia pages of their respective religions. But even still, you can easily see elements of the Great Lie interspersed within these religions and cults on their respective side of the dialectic. The versions of the lie contained within these public-facing satanic religions and false Christian cults may seem completely crazy, but the impact that their overarching beliefs have on mainstream society is much greater than you might imagine. Today's mystery schools are essentially the way the Gnostic worldview gets distributed to the masses of culture, perpetuating the Great Lie onto the core pillars of civilization, whether through overt religion or more modern philosophical thinking. While the light side Christian Gnostic religions don't necessarily associate with the dark practices of the occult religions, they are still two distinct opposing sides after all. The principles of both orders propagate themselves onto the greater sphere of non-religious society to create the thesis, antithesis, synthesis cycle of the modern day. I talked briefly about this in the last video, but here I want to flush it out in detail because this truly is the crux of the apotheotheistic dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is the concept of tearing down an established thesis supported by one side of the dialectic that conflicts with an opposing antithesis which coalesces through the discord of the populace. The result is mutual synthesis, where a compromise can be reached, but that compromise goes on to become the basis for a new thesis and becomes the grounds for conflict once more. This cycle is precisely what drives the dialectic machine forward, and how light and dark political establishments take turns being in power. A more simplistic way of looking at this is the concept of problem, reaction, solution. It's the same principle as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. An establishment creates a problem to get a reaction out of the people they oversee to allow them to come up with the solution you desired in the first place. Take the classic superhero villain Syndrome from Pixar's The Incredibles. Syndrome's desire was to be loved and praised by the people of Metroville, the fictional city in the Incredibles universe. The problem was that Syndrome didn't have any superpowers, so therefore he was at a disadvantage. But his brilliant mind moved him to be able to create various inventions that he could mass produce and sell to the public. He deduced that if he could make it to where everyone in Metroville could buy his inventions, it would make everyone in the city a superhero, and therefore there would be no need for actual superheroes to exist, and he would make a huge fortune as a bonus. But first, Syndrome had to make a name for himself, so he created a remote-controlled siege robot designed to cause mayhem and collateral damage and drop it on the city. Then, all Syndrome had to do was put on his magnificent superhero costume and swoop in and disable the robot and make the citizens of Metroville believe he was the one who was saving the city, and hence be the one to win the hearts of the people and use them as the means to wipe out the genetic line of real supers. Here's the breakdown of his plan. The problem: Syndrome creates a robot to cause devastation and uses it to kill all the supers that could stand against him. Then he drops it on the city. The reaction: the citizens are in a panic and look to the supers to save them. However, there's no one there to save them because all the superheroes have been outlawed or killed, and they react with fear. The solution: Syndrome comes to the rescue, fighting off the evil robot invader as a new superhero with the power to not only defeat the robot, but also help everyone rise up to become superheroes themselves. Syndrome had to create a problem in order to get the solution he wanted by getting the people to react to it. The implementation of a problem is the most important aspect of the problem-reaction-solution cycle. The problem almost always involves the creation or the manipulation of a crisis. This could be economic downturns, health emergencies, or social unrest. Often the severity of the crisis is inflated to an extreme level and orchestrated to create a sense of fear and urgency from the public to do something about it. Fear-mongering is a powerful weapon in the hands of those who wield it. If the controlling party can establish a sense of fear into everyone, they can then peddle that fear and use it to sell you things, whether it be material goods, ideological stances, or the motivation to do something different. Because people won't hesitate to buy into the motivation to change something if they're scared for their safety. And crisis is a perfect way to threaten someone's safety. The second step, reaction, only comes naturally. The natural response to a crisis is a demand for a resolution. The public often react predictably out of their fear and driven by their feelings. During the reaction phase, the problem or crisis continues to evolve, and fear-mongering increases, furthering the sense of urgency to come up with a resolution. The solution becomes reality in one of two ways. The first way is the public, out of their response and reaction to the problem, generate a solution to solve the crisis. The solution was what was desired by the entity who peddled the problem in the first place, and knew that it would be the reaction to the problem before they even implemented the crisis. People are very predictable in times of emergency, and they knew the outcome would be exactly what they planned from the beginning, and hence the desired solution was achieved. The second way is when the crisis or problem reaches an apex, the entity who created the problem steps in with their own solution to the problem. This is what Syndrome did. The solution presented is seemingly well thought out and logical, but it often only serves the interests of a select few, but yet promises to solve the crisis. But the solution almost always serves the interests of the controlling entity, because, well, the solution they presented is the solution they wanted all along. After some time has passed, could be months, could be centuries, the opposing side of the dialectic, whichever one that opposes the controlling entity, steps up and starts the process all over again. They see the solution that was executed to solve the first crisis as a hindrance to their agenda, and they create a new crisis to get a new reaction to implement a new solution that coincides with their ideal version of reality. And this cycle continues on and on endlessly forever, because this is the matrix cycle that the enemy has us trapped in. I call it the dualistic loop of doom. Let me try and illustrate this for you, because this template will tie further into a point that I have here in a second. So over here on the left, we have our dark side pyramid, and over here we have our inverted light side pyramid. I drew this pyramid upside down for a reason I'll explain here in a moment. The direction, or the tip of the triangle, points in the direction of who is in the position of power. If this seems weird, bear with me. It'll all make sense in a moment. So here at the top of the template, we have the elite leaders and the people that are in positions of power. This can be anyone. It can be the president, the British Prime Minister, or the chairman of your local HOA board. Here at the bottom of the template is the common citizen or person. This would represent you and me, and any average citizen of society. So the dualistic loop of doom starts off by one side, doesn't matter which one, standing up and saying, hey, your leaders, your king, your HOA president is evil. And when the accusing party comes together and agrees on the fact that the opposing side is evil, they then say, we can do better. We as a collective can work as one side and implement our own agendas. So by means of the problem reaction solution motif, they kickstart what I call an inversion, which is just the process to flip the zeitgeist from light to dark or dark to light. Remember, both sides of the dialectic use problem reaction solution to tear down the opposing side. But eventually, a person will step forward and go, hey, I can do better. I can lead the people in the way that I think they should be led. And another inversion takes place, and the cycle is complete. Your leaders are evil, we can do better. Your leaders are evil, we can do better. The loop of doom is used to create an inversion in any dark versus light situation. The dark will always be opposed to the light, which will always be the means for conflict. Each side seeks to tear down the other side to implement their matrix as the primary system of operation. In the example I just presented, I showed a dark to light inversion. The dark elite leaders were torn down and the common person was established as the primary ruler of society. An example of this would be the sequence of events in a communism versus democracy dialectic. Communism, regardless of its light-seeming talk of equity and removal of the bourgeoisie elite, is a dark order government system because it puts controlling leaders over society in positions of power that can rule over the common person to prevent chaos from breaking out. A democracy is a light order system because it puts the power into the hands of the people to promote change. It's the government by the people, for the people. But remember, both sides are pursuing their version of enlightenment. It's just they disagree on how it's structured, so therefore it's set up differently. Sometimes it can be difficult to differentiate whether a political, ideological, philosophical, or religious affiliation is light or dark established. So let me expand on my loop of doom template. This is where the direction of the pyramids come into play. So on the dark side, the pyramid is pointing towards the elite that govern or control the establishment. Think of the cliché illustration of the Illuminati. At the top of the pyramid, you have the all-seeing eye that looks down on the masses and illuminates the common people to their beliefs, picking and choosing where to light up the dark. The controllers who have all the esoteric knowledge then bestow that knowledge in a top-down fashion to the stinky and unwashed commoners with concave brains sitting at the bottom of the pyramid that only have exoteric knowledge. In order to do that, the enlightened must take their place at the top of the pyramid/hierarchy and establish control over the people, because it's the only way they can promote change and enlightenment to the lower elements of society, or to the dark world below. Dark political structures are where the concepts like the Great Reset and New World Order globalization originate. The elite at the top make policies saying, oh, we're going to build our 15-minute cities and you're going to eat bugs for the rest of your life and you'll own nothing and be happy. The elite know how to make everyone else enlightened because they sit at the top with all the esoteric knowledge, and they wouldn't have been put into an elite position in the first place if they didn't seem fit for that role. Again, keep in mind this viewpoint is all from the perspective of the Dark Order. It's not that they genuinely know what's best, but from their perspective it's the way to propel society forward, and hence how they structure their pyramid of hierarchy. All they're doing is living by their own version of the Tree of Knowledge paradigm. It's the Orwellian 1984 scene. Big Brother knows what's best. They build a hierarchy economy where they control all the essential resources needed to survive and ensure its citizens they have all of their needs met while promising protection to human rights and foreign threats. In contrast, in a light order structure, the tip of the pyramid is pointing to the individual. Here, gnosis still comes from the singular point of an individual person, but they are not at the elite top like it is in a Dark Order structure. The individual person within the masses is the enlightened because those following light order teachings believe that everyone has the ability to become educated because everyone has the spark of the divine within. So in a grassroots structure, gnosis is bestowed in a bottom-up fashion to everyone that is willing to listen through the free exchange of ideas and information. Light world structures put the power in the hands of the people to change the world from the foundation up to the dark, corrupt power structures that tend to take form in society. The light side is also where the more extreme ideas that the physical world or any centralized authority at all are the sources of the dark that must be overcome, because freedom of choice of the individual is what shines a light into the darkness around them. Anyone has the ability to impact change on the world, and the ability to change radiates from the light that is within the self. Sure, there might be leaders within a light order movement, but the leaders work to put the power into the hands of the common person so they can create their ideal society. So, here's the explanation in shorthand. Dark Order works to tear down the system to establish control over the unruly people to grant them their freedoms, according to how they see fit. While Light Order works to tear down the system to establish and protect the principles of freedom to ultimately gain control over the hearts and minds of the people. Dark Order works in a top-down hierarchy method to illuminate gnosis to the people. Light Order functions as a grassroots, bottom-up method to illuminate gnosis to the common citizen. But at the end of the day, both orders have humans at the center of reality. Any one person can choose which side to be on to fit their individualized path of enlightenment, but whether that person chooses a light or dark path, it doesn't matter. Both paths lead to the same goal. The occult has this in its twofold belief systems of left-hand and right-hand paths, each representing dark and light paths to enlightenment respectively. They are designed to be polar opposites, but we can see that both hands ultimately belong to the same magician, using one hand to misdirect you from looking at the other hand in its magic trick. To put it another way, there are many different brands of cereal you can buy at the grocery store. You can choose the healthy kind of cereal or the sugary non-nutritive cereal, but when you break down each one into its base primary ingredient, it's all just cornmeal. So far, I've made it clear that the devil is at the center of the dialectic and has a hand on both sides of the chessboard, and how both sides of the dialectical sphere are attributes that can be tied back to the enemy himself in the roles of his two titles as both a light-bringer and an adversary, Lucifer and Satan. But what does this all mean? What does all of this have to do with the future and the final acts of society? Here's the thing. Satan hates God. He's not out to ruin your life personally or the lives of collective humanity out of spite against us. His primary motivation is to spite God, to get back at him for casting him out of his exalted light-bringer position. He understands the gospel, that humanity and God cannot exist in the same space when sin is in the picture. He knew that long before the events of Genesis 3, which I would argue is why he immediately went to destroy man, God's prized creation, through the introduction of sin which brought about death. God's original plan was to create a perfect people in a perfect place to worship a perfect God. God's desire is to be in union with his people, but God's perfect law had to be upheld because of the sin we chose to chase after. But God was willing to overlook our sins to keep that unity intact, so he crushed his own son so the veil between us and God could be broken, and we may live again in perfect unity with him. But those who choose to live in the tree of knowledge paradigm cannot be in union with God. The law of death still remains. It would be unjust if God let those who live for the self get off the hook. As strange as this might sound, this saddens God. 1 Thessalonians 5:9 says, "For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." But God is also completely just, and his wrath is completely warranted. He cannot allow sin into his presence, or he would not be completely just, and thus would not be God. Satan knows this. He hates us because of his hatred towards God. He knew if he could create division between man and God by means of sin, that would withhold God's desire of being in unity with his own people. Satan and his fallen can't make open war on God himself. He tried that already unsuccessfully. But if God is connected through his creation by means of the human heart, if you can turn man to reject God, then that is a direct attack against God as a person. He wants to take God's place and direct worship towards himself. That's his desire. In order to do this, he has to use man's desire to chase after an attribute of himself. I alluded to this earlier, saying that he caters to a man's individual matrix, whether that be good or evil. The adversary wants both sides of him to be worshipped, whether that's his light side or dark side, because either side keeps us separated from God. You're either worshipping the works and the sins of the flesh, or idolizing the fruits of the Holy Spirit. Just as he caters to the individual matrix of you and me, he caters to the desires of the GMs of society. And when you control the GMs on the dark and light side, you now control the game board and can steer all of humanity in the way that you want. You are the ultimate game master. You control the simulation. And Satan is exactly that. He truly is the god of this world, and the whole world lies in his power. His ultimate goal is to get you to take that power for yourself and live in discord apart from God. So, knowing that the adversary is out to spite God by means of using the loop of doom to destroy humanity and keeping them from spending eternity with him, this leads to the ultimate question. What is Satan's plan? How will he use the tree of knowledge paradigm to keep us fixated on the self, which will ultimately lead to the eternal separation between us and God? The true and foundational answer is... I have no clue. But I do have a theory, and that's what I will be looking to unpack in my next video, and really through the rest of the series. I'm going to use what we've learned about Gnostic apotheotheism, the loop of doom, and the worship of idols, whether they be graven images or self-actualization schools of thought, and combine it with biblical history, prophecy, and eschatology to try and answer that question. By means of controlling the GMs of society and the system by which they hold power, the enemy is cooking up a plan that's going to be very effective, and we as believers must be ready for it. The loop of doom is the egg that will hatch forth the horrid beasts from Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, setting up the counterfeit Trinity to sit in place of the Holy Trinity as the epitome of idol worship, so much so that man will become so in love with himself that he will forfeit his place in God's kingdom as the bride of Christ by moving them to commit the unforgivable sin. It is absolutely evil and sinister. What's even more sinister is that our adversary knows the impending judgment coming his way. He knows that there is no mercy in store for him for what he has done against God and his creation. Thus, he wishes to destroy God's people in any way, shape, or form possible, because he knows he has nothing to lose. This concludes part 3 of the series. Thanks again for sticking out up to this point. The first 3 parts of this series are meant to be watched as a standalone trilogy to get people up to speed on these broader concepts that are important to understand the bigger picture. In our next discussion, we will be applying a lot of these things we've covered alongside the lens of biblical prophecy to get a look at the bigger picture throughout time, where hopefully you will be able to see some more of the theory I've been covering applied in real scriptural and historical examples. The many idols our enemy puts in front of us appear in many forms, depending on what it is and what we like to pursue the most. But once you learn to recognize the pattern, it becomes clear that they all exist as parts of a much larger idol whose presence is felt throughout our history. Until that point, thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate all the support I've received on the channel so far. and encourage you to continue to share this series with anyone you would feel would be edified by its content. Look forward to continuing the discussion. See you next time.